TIL Strom Thurmond remained in the U.S. Senate until he was 100. He was a Democrat until civil rights became a priority of the party. He then left the party to become a Republican. He conducted the longest filibuster in history, over 24 hours, to oppose a piece of civil rights legislation. He was pro-segregation but claimed to not be racist, justifying his stance by saying that he was just in favor of me, if you heard this right. He was basically just a Confederate born a little too late. In the Strom Thurmond wing of the Aiken County Historical Society, there's an enormous framed photograph of Thurmond walking his future wife to her first day of school. They later married when he was 66 and she was 22. Locals view the relationship as a charming fairy tale about a sweet little princess who tamed old rascal Strom, and not grooming, trafficking and rape. The federal government should have an age limit across the board. Something like 70 would be fair. People who are older should not be running the country. They will not be vested in long-term problems since they will be gone, for example climate change. Their mental state is questionable since even the functional ones are subject to rapid decline at any time. The segregationist in power well into in the late 90s. Of course he officially renounced being a former segregationist when it was no longer a politically popular stance. X200B. Also the mentor of Joe Biden. A fact that Biden likes to sweep under the rug. Not a Biden supporter nor critic, but this should be noted. Isn't this a guy who fucked Puerto Rico by writing a clause that wouldn't let them refinance their bonds? I feel like I remember reading that somewhere. People were trying to figure out his motivation for doing that by digging through his memoirs. My guess is he was probably just a prick. Fun fact: Joe Biden eulogized his good friend Strom Thurmond at his funeral. Joe Biden claimed to be pro-civil rights early in his political career during the eulogy, which contradicts his actual opposition to desegregation, as it would lead to children growing up in a racial jungle. Can't mention Strom and forget he got a 15 or 16-year-old servant girl pregnant when he was 23. She was quietly taken care of by the family, raised by her aunt-uncle, and the Thurmond family paid for her to go to a historically black college. She kept quiet until after Strom died. One day, probably far into the future, assuming someone can sit on the Senate or any governmental position that long, I hope it's because people actually want them there and not because they have the backing and funding to railroad a campaign into the position forever. Guy was so old that he called the microphone senators talked into at the podium the machine. Not even joking. I remember seeing him on TV when I was younger, and at the end he was basically a real version of Weekend at Bernie's. No idea how capable he was, but I'm not 100% opposed to people serving when they're older. I do think they should have to take a cognitive test to show that they're still functioning at a certain level, like a driver's test. What's especially crazy is, it's not like he just refused to leave, he kept getting elected, even after all the stuff he apparently got up to with the younger ladies. Damn, what an electorate. Anytime I see an old, white politician that was in office in the 50s 60s, I assume they were probably from the South and racist as fuck. Guess it's true for this one. I want to be mad, but he did what anyone in his position would do. Instead, let's talk about South Carolina voting for a 94-year-old senator. When Carol Moseley Braun, the first African-American woman elected to the U.S. Senate, would get on the elevator with him, he would start whistling Dixie. Zombie Senate. Corporations don't need living, thinking politicians. Just brain-dead walking corpses who can say yay or nay on command. Man was completely senile the last years of his Senate career. Remind you of a certain Senator California? Among others in places of power. Racist, sexist and homophobic piece of shit, and was well known to sexually assault women inside of the Capitol. Kept his job. Shameful. Absolutely disgusting. There needs to be term limits at least. Annual cognitive tests for all members over 65 would be better. Dude was literally the living embodiment of why we need both term limits and a mandatory retirement age for elected officials. I used to think he was an out-of-touch racist, but if he were alive today I think he'd fit right in with today's Republicans. A despicable man in every sense of the word. Another glaring example of why the US Senate should have term limits. Totally racist bastard who was behind the impetus to get Nixon to try to throw John Lennon out of the US in the 70s. And he was a racist piece of shit the whole time. He loved segregation and hated civil rights. Fuck this guy. He filibustered the Civil Rights Act, yet he served in the Senate until 2003. That's just fucked up. The people of South Carolina found a racist they liked and decided they didn't need to leave the 1950s. Pretty sure the founding fathers had clear views on people remaining in power their entire lives. Wait! Were you in the room listening to the ENT, too? I was reminded of that fact today, too. face with monocle. We need global age limits for politicians. 70 maybe? 60 would be better, but maybe not doable. That bitch voted for and kept voting for an open racist piece of hot garbage. The only way he lives that long was because he was fueled by 70 racism and 30 hypocrisy. Interesting that he began to moderate his stance on race after becoming a Republican. There's senators on both sides of the aisle vying to break that dinosaur's record. He was a terrible person. The fact he stayed in office for so long is a disgrace. Racist till the day he died. A true forebearer of the modern racist Republicans. Here comes Reddit on their weekly self-righteous pitchfork hunt. Go get him, boys. I wonder if he was in that hearing to confirm Robert Downey Jr. in Oppenheimer. Read this as Strom Thurmond remained an asshole in the Senate until he was 100. He ran for President of the United States in 1948, was still a senator in 2003. Mitch McConnell is trying to break his record, both in age and being a prick. Is American gerontocracy older than the geriatrics currently running it? Coincidentally, that's also the number of years he was a piece of shit. And he was a racist piece of shit until the day he drew his last breath. He was an utter piece of shit. So were the people who voted for him. He was a relic from a different time. And that was when he was 30. And remains an asshole, bigoted, rapist and racistic to this day. The good die young, and the pricks live forever. George Carlin. He was a piece of shit for an awful long time, like many now. A giant piece of shit. Should have died so much earlier. And there are many senators trying to beat that record. Never less deserving person. Old racist regressive.